I am thrilled that we have Howard Scott Warshaw, truly a game industry legend, on the interview series today. Howard and I were actually talking a bit before we started the live feed here. I first met Howard back at the San Jose Convention Center. I think it was, like I said, 2002 or so, at the Classic Gaming Expo. And Howard has a DVD set called Once Upon Atari that he was gracious enough to sign for me, and it sits actually as part of my kind of locked away collection, so nothing kind of happens to it. But one of the quotes that I remember from your from the DVD was, on January 11th, I think it was 1981, I reported for my first day as a game programmer at Atari and changed my life forever.
Exactly.
Right? And you were flipped upside down and hang upside down, and your hair was kind of sticking up, and I was like, oh my God, I cannot wait to dig into this documentary. So Howard, thank you so much for joining us and spending time with us today.
That's great to be here. I'm really happy to be here. I mean, I'm happy to be anywhere, but this is a great opportunity. So thank you, Chris, for having me on.
Oh, no, it's absolutely my pleasure. My pleasure. All right. So let's go ahead and jump right in there. A lot of questions we're going to go ahead and try to get through and talk about your incredible history, and really being there on the front lines as the video games industry was really starting and kind of hitting full tilt. But before Atari, we didn't have access to home computers. Most of the things were either university or in government facilities. Like, what was your journey into computers? Did you always know you wanted to work with them, or tell us a bit about your history with computers prior to Atari?
Well, it's kind of ironic because actually I avoided computers like the plague. I mean, when I was in high school and going into college, computers were like a big coming thing, but was it a fad? Was it this? Nobody really knew. And I wasn't that focused on computers. I was much more focused on the business and economics curriculum. And I had a chance to play with computers in high school and blew it off. A lot of my friends, we had a terminal. I went to high school in New Jersey, and we had a remote terminal to Rutgers University, which was a super unusual thing back then. We actually had a terminal that you could do APL coding on. I don't know if anybody even knows what that is, but it was an incredibly obscure math-based language. And a lot of my friends were into it. I just had no interest in it. And I got into college, and I stayed away from computers. I assiduously avoided them. Whereas most of the people who came to Atari were people, this was about the time where a few home microcomputers that were in the multi-$1,000 range were just starting to hit the market and come out. And most of the people at Atari were people who had did everything they could to get a computer, learn to program on microcomputers, and made their way into Atari because they just loved the idea of computing. I avoided computers. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. But in my economics curriculum, at one point, one of my professors said to me, if you're really going to go anywhere in economics, you've got to have some computer background. I said, okay, so I'll try a computer course. And I jumped in the middle of a semester into a computer course. And long story short, I did the first half of the course that night, finished the course about 2 nights later, and realized, oh my God, I don't know why I've been staying away from this, because this was great. Computers to me were the answer to everything, because you didn't have to read these long involved books. You didn't have to write long papers. You just got to solve puzzles, and that was the whole thing. And I loved that. So I finished off my economics. I finished off a math major and jumped into computers. And I got a 1-year master's in computer engineering. And Zoom took off for Silicon Valley, and worked at Hewlett Packard. I started off at Hewlett Packard,
right,
which was miserable because all the joy and love that I had found in computing, particularly real-time microprocessor programming, which was something I got to do in college, which was very unusual back then. And at HP, it was just mainframe programming with a lot of, big, heavy, slow, uninteresting, non-challenging programming assignments. And I just thought, oh my God, I thought I liked computers. What happened? What's going on? And then through a series of events I discuss in my book, it was a pure coincidence that someone happened to mention Atari to me because their wife worked there. And I thought, oh, well, maybe that's an interesting place to work. And I went and interviewed with them. And it's funny because most people went to Atari to make games. That's why they went, because Atari was the game place. You love games. That's why you go. Games was like the third reason that I went to Atari. The first reason I went to Atari was because they were doing real-time control programming on microprocessors. And that's the kind of work I really like to do. And the other reason I went there was because I was so bored at HP. I was like a zoo case, and I was acting out all the time, and it really wasn't working out well at HP. And at Atari, I fit right in because they had a wild atmosphere, a wild creative atmosphere, and that worked for me. And the fact that they did games was a nice plus, but it wasn't really why. So I sort of backed into the whole thing. Atari. In fact, after my first round of interviews at Atari, they rejected me. Atari actually rejected me at first. And I just begged, barred, and pushed my way in and took a cut in pay and went on probation. I did anything I could because I knew that was a place I had to be. And literally the rest is history.
Okay. So we've just covered a huge swath of how you got in there. You were at Tulane, and that's where you kind of did this stuff. Then you went to HP. And I was going to ask you, going into HP, you certainly must have felt a bit out of place, or either that, or people are like, we don't know, what this kid is doing in here. Like, doesn't look like us, doesn't act like us. That time that you spent in HP, what was, let's say one of the more memorable things that you got to work on while at HP? Kind of something you look back and go, okay, yeah, that was pretty cool. I got to do that.
Well, I mean, at HP, I was put into what they call the multi-terminal system engineer program, right? So I was networking. And this was when networks were just starting. This is still pre-internet. I had actually written some routing software, some low-level routing software on the ARPANET, which is what became the internet ultimately. So I actually had written some code for the web early on. And because of that, they put me in the multi-terminal system and networking stuff. And I was working on what was called the X.25 networking protocol, because they were looking at standardizing ways for people off the web to connect to the web. And so there was a standardized way, and this was a protocol that was used just for that. So I was writing interface routines so that people, it was sort of like an API for an early web, would be an easy way to describe it. And it was just boring as hell because it was just the simplest, most grunt-like programming you could do. And it wasn't challenging, it wasn't interesting. So I spent most of my time there playing games with the other engineers. We had a few computer games there that I loved to play. There was a driving game, there was a football game, and Star Trek. We did have a good Star Trek program. And so at 5 o'clock, everybody would get on the net and we would play our multi-terminal interactive Star Trek. And that was fun. I enjoyed that. But the rest of the work there was just, for me, it was horrible. I mean, for a lot of people it was fine, but for me, it was just horrible. And, the idea of like, what are we going to do with this guy? It seems like we should be able to do something cool with him, but we don't know what to do. People frequently run into that problem with me.
You know what? I think it's so with you, yes, but also with so many of us that by hook or by crook figure out a way to kind of snake our way into the industry, right? Just it was bang on doors all the time. I remember I was sharing a story with somebody that the very first panel I ever sat on was at the Harvard Cyberposium, I think in like 1999, where I convinced the organizer of the panel that I should be on there, even though I held no position for games, but I'd been trying to push the company to let me do this. So I figured, what better way than to sit next to the CEO of Hasbro, pretend that I hold this position at the company, speak my mind, and that ultimately helped me kind of get in the game space. So, when you mentioned knocking on the doors of Atari, one of the first person I interviewed for this series was RJ Michael. We're going to talk about him and your time at 3DO. And it was the same thing. Talked about how, he's calling Williams, just phone call after phone, going through the whole directory till he gets to this young programmer, named Noah Falstein, who says, okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and bring you in, right? Because it's the passion to go ahead and apply computer science and programming to the art and creativity side that wasn't feeding that side of you at HP, right? So you had no other place to go but Atari. It's the only place that could contain you.
It's the same way Spielberg got into movies. He just walked on the lot and just started acting like he worked there. and it worked out. And you did the same thing. We all do. At some point, when you realize what you need to do, when you really realize what you need to do, you can become an unstoppable force in moving in that direction. And you have to.
That's right. That's right. Standing by those convictions and belief that you're going to help to do something positive and change, the industry, the world, the space, right? So, all right. So let's go back to Atari. You joined in 1981.
Right. Very beginning of 81.
April 11th, right? I believe.
January.
Oh, January 11th. There you go. And then, so you said that a friend of yours introduced you to the company. And you already said
no,
kind of
what happened
made
was a coworker just told me that their wife happened to work there and said that they do wacky stuff all day the way I would do things at HP. And so I thought, this is a place maybe I should take a look at.
All right. So you get in, you knock on all these doors, they reject you, but you keep persevering. You finally get in. What was your impression walking through the door? Was it what you thought it was going to be? Did it exceed your expectations? Young HSW.
It incredibly exceeded my expectations. It was everything I could have imagined and beyond my dreams. In the book, I do a whole section on my first day at Atari, which was an amazing experience because I got to Atari, I got to walk in, went through the whole HR thing, which was kind of ridiculous because engineering was very much separated from the rest of the company at Atari because engineering was a wild and crazy place, which it needed to be, which wasn't really appropriate for the rest of the company to be dealing with. And so I went through an HR presentation of like, here's your benefits and here's this and here's what working at the company is like. And then I go across the street to engineering, which is nothing like what anything I had just heard, which was great. And they gave me a room assignment and they stuck me in an office, gave me some manuals, and that was it. And I would wander around. And then my manager came and started introducing me around. And the first time I went into one of the labs, so this was the way it was like a quad. On the exterior of the quad were windowed offices where everybody just sat and maybe did some coding by hand. And then on the interior where there's no windows, because you don't want anybody seeing in, that's where the actual game development was going on. So it was more closed. And labs were open in the sense that it was just a room where a bunch of development systems against the walls and a large open space in the center. And I walked in and I looked around, and there on these series of displays are all the upcoming games. Here are games that are in development. And I realized I was really at the hub. I was like in the vortex of something amazing that was going on. And I remember thinking to myself specifically, there's millions and millions of people out there that would like practically kill to get in here to get a look at what's coming up. And here it is, and these are my colleagues now. And it still hadn't quite dawned on me that I was going to have to now make, something too, but that was coming. And it was just amazing because also I was a huge movie freak, right? I was aware of video games. I knew video games were going to be big, but I was not that compelled to play them initially. I was into movies and I liked the idea of broadcast medium. And I realized that video games was like the new medium. And the idea of being at the center, at the core of creating and marching in a new medium was super exciting to me. The idea of being able to innovate at that level just meant a lot to me. So when I got there, I started to really get the sense that this is what was happening. And that was super exciting. And it was that mixed with a lot of manual reading. And then there was also just walking around the hallways and trying to meet people. And there was some wacky people at Atari, which made me very comfortable. I could see it making other people uncomfortable. There were people walking down the hallways speaking gibberish out loud to themselves. There were people playing games like bocce with lemons in the hallways. You had to be careful not to mess their game up. And because it was a really kind of crazy environment, which was perfect. And then another thing that was very big in the environment, of course, was drugs. There was a lot of drugs at Atari. Marijuana flowed very freely in a lot of ways. And one of the toppers at the end of my first day was one of my roommates. I'm just sitting there reading manuals towards the end of the day. And this guy just comes in slams the door shut, look,
Oh,
if you don't want to be around this, you need to get out of here. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to introduce yourself to a new employee. But I actually was aware from the interview that that was the case, and I was fine with that. So I had actually brought a joint with me just in case this opportunity came up, because, you know, you want to be prepared. So I said to him, hey, you know, I brought something myself, you know, like to share. And he just sort of looked at me and he said, nah, he goes, I've got some real stuff here. You know, so he was like a pot snob already. And I thought, this is odd. But I joined him, you know, and I realized, wow, he was right. It was really high quality stuff. And I realized I would have to up my game in a lot of ways, you know, to really fit in at Atari. That was my first day.
That's just fantastic. And you've already basically clipped through about 8 different questions I had on company culture and what it was like at the time. And really, you know, to kind of sum all of it up is people had an idea of what video games could be, but it was really at the beginning. So nobody knew where it was going to go. So it was one of the most experimental you know, companies, not just at the time, but I think in the history of the industry. In fact, I remember even at Sun Microsystems, which I was there for 16 years, you know, talking to some of the early founders there. They're like, you know, we're looking at this little company, Atari, and going, you know, how do we kind of replicate that same sort of not culture, let's say, but how do we replicate the same sort of success and kind of growth trajectory they're on? Like, what are they doing there? How do we emulate that? And that wasn't just unique to Sun. That was unique to most tech companies in the Valley that were looking at Atari going, how the hell are you doing this?
And that's the thing. I'm really glad that I have my economics background when I went to Atari, because it gave me a real appreciation of it. And this is another major theme of the book. You know, my Once Upon Atari book, I talk a lot about corporate culture.
Which, by the way, is linked right there. And there's a link right there that you can purchase right off of Amazon or available on Kindle as well. So there you go.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Or you can go to onceuponatari.com and get an autographed copy if you care to.
Even better.
But the thing is that it was very interesting to me because the culture, when you talk about corporate culture, Atari was one of the first technotainment companies, right? This was one of the first places that was really trying to integrate technology and entertainment. And this was a new kind of business. It called for a new style of management. And when I showed up, this was the most amazing place I could ever imagine there was to work. Yet there were people walking around going, man, this place used to be so cool. I can't believe how it's getting kind of messed up. And it blew my mind. Like, you know, how can this be something that used to be cooler? This is unbelievable. But I showed up right in the middle of an amazing cultural transition. Right? Because the big story of Atari, in fact, the big story of video games and the crash, all the stuff that happened, was the story of Nolan Bushnell, who was basically an engineer, who became the manager and the founder, co-founder of Atari. And he had a culture of creativity and really trying to make good product and move that out. And at one point, Warner bought them out. Warner bought him out, kind of pushed him out, and put in their own culture of business and trying to make money first, and games and creativity were second. And there was this wave was going on, and it was a creativity-based culture, and then it became a profit-based culture. And it's very different. And the way I always like to sum it up is that, you know, there's two kinds of people in business, right? There's people who make things, and there's people who make money from people who make things. And they're both valid and they're both necessary. And I don't mean to demean either, but it's a very big difference, because the people who make things, they want to make the best thing they can make. And they want what they make to be really cool. They want it to be breakthrough, and they want it to be innovative. And they don't care how long it takes. They just want to make sure they do something that's really high quality. And the people who make money from people who make things don't particularly care all the time what it is that's getting made, as long as it's out and you can sell it and you can start moving it because you need to get money. And so there's an inherent resentment between the two, right? There's this tension, and I go into that quite a bit in the book. And what's interesting is a lot of people tell me that the things that I described that was the case at Atari, is absolutely still in operation today. Everywhere you go, you see this interdepartmental tension and acrimony at times, because engineers don't want to put out a product they all feel embarrassed about, because they may have to go out into the industry and find a job at some time, and they want their work to represent them well. And marketers and management and people like that say, well, it's all very well and good to do a nice product, but you also want to get your salary paid. And to do that, we have to have revenue. We have to have money coming in. So we need to get this thing out and start selling it so we can get that money coming in so that we can afford to make a better product. And they're both right. Everybody, and that's the thing. And the story of Atari, that's the story at so many places, is a bunch of pretty smart people. There weren't really many dummies at Atari. It was a lot of very smart people, but with very different agendas. And so the way I put it sometimes, the story of Atari is the story of a bunch of really smart people all joining hands together and walking off a cliff together, because they were all so blinded by their agendas, they really couldn't get to a common mindset that would move everyone forward together. Yeah. And that wasn't really the case with Nolan. With Nolan's creative culture, it wasn't like that, but there wasn't a really strong marketing and business aspect to that company. As they shifted over, it overcompensated into this production and business and profit center mentality. And they started to really short the idea of the product. And that drop in quality ended up biting them in the butt. And then there was the bigger picture stuff. But it was interesting.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that too. I mean, and that's part of, it's known as like the founder's dilemma, right? Founder starts the company with passion and uncertainty of what the future is going to be, but belief, right? Just pure, unbridled belief in what they're doing. They hit success. And then at some point, it becomes a quote unquote real business. How do you scale that? How do you then stop making the things just for you and start making them for what the market wants, for what the players want, right? In the case of games. And so, yeah, it couldn't just be a free for all the time. There had to have the structure. And to your point, when the company was sold to Warner Communications and Ray Kazar came in, who had a background in textiles and manufacturing, certainly a huge culture clash, right? So my question was going to be, did you ever get a high-strung prima donna t-shirt as well? Or were those given out?
Absolutely did. Oh, I was definitely one of the high-strung prima donnas. There's no question about it. And that comment, of course, that comment reflects what planted and sowed the seeds that destroyed the industry in the early 80s, right? Because Kazar came in, and Ray Kazar, like you said, he was from Burlington. He was a textile manufacturing executive who knew nothing about technology, nothing about entertainment. And he was brought in to take over this wild, crazy tech company. And so that was a disaster in some ways, because his idea was, he saw a business. Now, he had a classical mentality, and I don't mean to demean him. He was a smart guy also, and he was successful, and he had done this. But what he did, there's a thing I talk about in the book called BMOBS, B-M-O-B-S, right? And that's an acronym, and it stands for Believe My Own Bullshit Syndrome. Okay, and BMOBS was a thing that a lot of people at Atari fell victim to, including engineers. And we all felt we were amazing. When you get, so Kazar comes in and he has a classical management approach, which is not going to suit this new type of industry. He doesn't know that. He's been very successful. Warner reached out and hired him because he's successful, right? And he shows up. He's not going to say, well, yeah, I know how to do that, but I don't know how to do this. So he starts right off believing his own stuff, right? I mean, he's buying it. He goes, yes, I'm going to show up. I'm going to make this thing happen. And it does happen, and it takes off. I mean, Atari is literally the fastest rising company in American business history. Yeah. And Kazar happened to be at the helm when that happened. Now, I believe that Nolan was the one who really created the product and the basis and had caught the zeitgeist of the time. And it's like, the way I put it is, Nolan put the rocket on the launch pad and then hit the launch button. And then they switched out and put Ray Kazar in charge. So he was there while the rocket took off. So he got a lot of accolades. Everybody thought, wow, everybody's a genius, right? The people at Warner think, look, we changed the management structure and look at the success we're having. And Ray Kazar is getting these incredible bonuses for doing this. And what's he going to say? He's going to go, well, thank you, but I really have no idea what was going on. So he's going to buy into it, and they're going to keep pushing and pushing. And in the meantime, they're promoting policies that are not really working with moving the product forward. And so the prima donna, the high-strung prima donna comment, where this comes from is there was an interview because there were a group of Atari programmers, the premier programmers, they call them the Fantastic Four. And they realized that Atari was making incredible amounts of money. And the programmers were basically getting fairly low-level salaries and minor bonuses, token bonuses. And that's it. There was no royalties, there was no anything like that. But this was a one engineer, one product, one engineer per product thing. And those products were generating anywhere from $1 to $10 or $20 million in revenue. Okay. And you would pay a programmer, your total outlay was maybe 30, 40,000 to create that product. So that's an incredible margin. And the programmers started to get this idea. So several of them went to Ray Kazar and said, hey, we want a piece of the pie. You need to give us, better compensation. Now, Ray Kazar did not hear, oh, here's some innovative people who are willing to work for me at a pretty low level of money, and I can give them a little more money, which will seem like a lot of money to them, and they'll just keep pumping out games for me. That's not what he heard. What he heard was, oh my God, people at the bottom of the org chart are demanding more from me. This is going to get out of hand. I will not have this kind of stuff. So he took a hard line on them. And he said, look, you could really tell he came from Burlington, okay? Because what he said to them literally was, you guys are a bunch of towel designers. He goes, and you're a dime a dozen.
Oh, we lost Howard.
So those four guys left, and they formed Activision.
So that was David Crane,
Larry Kaplan, Bob Whitehead, and Al Miller.
Yep.
Was the four people. And they left and they formed Activision. And when that happened, see, one thing about
and by the way, and then Rob Fulop left to go start a Magic after he got his coupon for a turkey as the bonus.
Yeah, that's a major story in the book. I talk about the three Christmas, right? There's the series of three Christmases that really formed and shaped Rob Fulop's experience. Rob Fulop is the guy who did Missile Command for the 2600, did incredible. Demon Attack later for Imagic, did some incredible games, was a very talented programmer. Again, someone who was not given any kind of real compensation and decided to take their work elsewhere.
Yeah.
But this was Ray Kazar. Ray Kazar's attitude was, we're not going to pay you anything because you're what he saw was people at the bottom of the org chart, which meant they were just cogs that were replaceable. He did not understand the idea that when you have creative or obscure technology capable people trying to do something as esoteric as create entertainment, that there is a skill factor involved that not everybody can do it. Yeah. I mean, at the time I was doing this, there was maybe 50 people in the world who were even capable of programming the 26.
Yep. Capable of programming the 2600.
So it was really an amazing challenge. But Ray didn't get that. So the price he paid wasn't just losing 4 engineers.
Yeah.
In the big picture, the price he paid was when they went out and looked for venture capital and went to try and find, a president and someone to organize it and get this thing rolling. The word got out about what a profit center Atari was. And then about a couple years later, another round of people, including Rob Fulop and Bob Smith, some people who were key Atari people, they left to form Activision, and then the dam broke. And that's when everybody got the idea of, holy cow, there's a tremendous amount of money there. And the problem with the game industry at that point was that it was the first product life cycle.
That's right.
And when nobody knows what to do. Your first time, you don't know anything. So what Atari didn't do, the big lesson that Atari missed was, when you're going to put out a game machine, they imagine it like a phonograph player, right? You put out a phonograph player and then you make records for it. but they were the only one who had the phonograph. So they didn't think of anybody else making records for it. So they didn't do anything to lock the system. Right? They didn't put any licensing restriction. And so anybody could make it. And everybody who put out a subsequent console fixed it so that you had to go through them to put a game out on it. Atari hadn't learned that lesson yet. Because remember I said, the culture of creativity and engineering that Nolan created did not have a strong legal department. And so they missed this core thing because they weren't perfect either. The Nolan culture was a lot more fun for a person who likes to make things. You know, I'm a person who makes things, you know, and that's where I like to be. And so that culture was really great for me. But that culture has some problems, just like the culture that's exclusively people who make money from make things has. Well, so wait, there's a lot of stories about this whole thing.
And to your point, I mean, then you start getting, you know, companies coming that have no business making video games, but are using it as a way to kind of capitalize on it, right? Chase the Chuck Wagon by Purina, or there was a Taxman, video game. Just an absolute amount of content that made its way into a market that completely then became oversaturated. So consumers didn't know what was good or what was bad, and everything kind of got painted with the same brush. Which,
well, not just oversaturated, but it was also, there was no quality control. So consumers got to a place where they didn't know when they bought a car. And those games were expensive at that time. But you didn't know if you were getting something that was really garbage or a quality game.
Yep, exactly. All right. So I've got about another 25 minutes with you. We dove deep on the culture and kind of what happened there. I want to take us through your greatest hits, right? So let's start with Yars Revenge. I know it wasn't the very first thing that you were tasked with programming. You were tasked, I believe it was
my first thing.
But wasn't Star Castle? Didn't they have you come in to look at doing that? Which then became the basis for Yars, right?
Right. It was assigned as a coin-op conversion of Star Castle, which I realized right away was going to suck. And I could not afford to have my first game suck. I had a lot of pride. I wanted to make my first game really cool. So even though I had begged and pleaded and was on probation, said, I will do anything for you, just let me in. After all of that begging, okay, here you go. We'll give you a shot. Here's your assignment. And within 3 days, I went back to them and said, you know, I don't think I should do this game. I think this game's really going to be horrible. It's like, but I didn't just say I don't want to do the game. I said, look, here's another game that I think would work on the system that would be pretty cool. And it'll play as good or better than that, but it won't suck. And I said, how about this instead? And they actually went for it. They said, okay. And so then I started launching on that and went through a whole ordeal in my first game. It was, and I go way into that. It's a really kind of an interesting story of not only, changing the direction, failing at it, having a breakthrough, having it turn into a monster kind of hit thing, then out marketing with it, because the naming of Yars is an interesting story, as well as the making of Yars.
And we're gonna get to there. I have Yars that actually plays
on
so I have Yars that is playable on this keychain level, this keychain game system. So I have Yars with me in my pocket. I also have our Once Upon Atari book by Tim Lapatino with the beautiful artwork, right, that adorn this, and we're gonna talk about that. So, all right, Yars, you decide not to do StarCast. You explain why that idea sucks. This one is going to be better, and to do so, you actually go and write a backstory for this world that you're creating. I believe one of the first times we had it, apart from some other kind of comic trends.
It was the first. There were a lot of firsts in Yars Revenge that went on to become industry standard, because I really did break a lot of new ground. It was the first full screen explosion. It was the first game with a pause mode. I mean, I invented pause mode essentially. And but one of the other firsts was I wrote, in the process of naming it, I wrote a backstory for it, because I thought a name and a story is stronger than just a name. And there's some interesting stuff about the name that you can check it out in the book, because it is quite a story about marketing. But the thing is that I wrote this story, and they took it and they decided, why don't we make an ancillary product? And they actually created a comic book, a separate additional product to go in the box with it to enhance the product value. And I had written the story for it. And that was cool. And because it became a secondary product, they had to put credits on the comic book. And because of that, I got credit for having programmed the game, and Atari never gave credit to programmers. So I believe Yars Revenge still stands as the only game Atari ever produced where the programmer is credited in the box, in the package with the thing. So I broke a lot of new ground with Yars, and that's what enabled me, that's what established me as a solid designer and positioned me to go and work with Steven Spielberg on the next game.
All right, so we're going to get to that too. So yeah, so in the game you also have an Easter egg in there. You're the first person to be credited on this, and Easter eggs like Warren Robinette's in Adventure had to be snuck in, right? Had to be snuck in without Atari knowing, versus you actually getting credit, right, by the company.
Right. So, and that was the distinction that I made, was I made Easter eggs in conjunction with marketing, because I went to Easter eggs, the origin of Easter eggs is the idea that Atari, because Atari didn't want to credit programmers, so suppose you go on an interview somewhere and they say, well, what have you done? You go, well, I did this game, like Warren Robinette's going to go interview. What'd you do? Well, I did the adventure game for Atari. Oh yeah, everybody says they did the adventure game. How do we know you did the adventure game? Because Atari won't tell us who did it. Right. And so the idea was you put something in the game that only you knew about. So if anybody ever challenged your authorship, you'd be able to do something in the game, and boom, there it is on the screen, and nobody else is going to put Warren Robinette's name in their game, right? So it was a way of identifying the game as yours so that you could prove ownership, because Atari wouldn't do it. That's where Easter eggs came from. What I did was I tried to turn them into a gaming value statement, but a value-added thing. So I went to marketing and said, look, these Easter eggs are going on there anyway. You don't have anybody in marketing who can read code to figure out where it is anyway. So I can put something in if I want in the game. You'll never be able to stop it. I said, but why don't we make it a feature? Why don't we make it a thing about the game? And so I was able to actually get the company on board behind Easter eggs. So I had one Easter egg in Yars. I had two in
Indiana
Raiders.
Yeah.
I had like 4 or 5 signatures in ET. I just kept increasing it. Also, they back referenced, they were cross-referencing products. I just turned it into like a major thing. I just blew the Easter egg thing up. And that was fun.
And I believe in Yars, the Easter egg was HSWWSH, which is an allusion to the actual name of the game, Yars, which is named after Ray Kazar, right? It is exactly. Ray's Revenge, but just backwards. And I think in an interview that I had listened to you give, you were playing around at the time with prose and kind of, really struck by spelling words forwards and backwards. So even your Easter egg kind of lent itself to that. So Yars is a runaway hit for Atari. In fact, the very first video game presentation I gave in the industry, I made a homemade Atari shirt, and the only other graphic on it was the Yars fly on my shoulder. So yeah, big place in my heart. I should also mention that Yars Revenge was one of the games added to the collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I had the good fortune of reviewing the original list before the MoMA went public with it, off the back of the Art of Video Games exhibition that we did for the Smithsonian. And I was like, of course, the list that's in there, myself and several other kind of game historians or people that have been around the industry for a while went, well, of course this needs to be here, right? So I was thrilled to see that it's permanently enshrined at the MoMA. Right.
It is. I mean, that was a bucket list item for me. That was like an amazing thing. When I found out that's it, I am now an exhibiting artist at the MoMA. Yeah. And it's like, I never knew how I would ever possibly get there. I always thought it would be cool. And there it is. It's like, holy cow. And, I really appreciate what you're saying, because as I like to say, a friend of Yars is a friend of mine.
All right. Yars is awesome. Also heavily resonated with women in user testing, which marketing kind of didn't believe, that women at the time were interested in space games, even though their own data demonstrated this, right?
That's another one of the great stories about it, where the conflict between marketing and engineering, because engineering kept wanting to see some kind of logical flow from marketing. And and we couldn't. And a great example of this was, they were screaming, we want games for women, because the only game, Centipede was a game that seemed to have some appeal for women. And that was a game that a woman actually worked on, the only coin-op at Atari that a woman had worked on. And then
that was Donna, I think it was Donna Bailey, right?
Donna Bailey, exactly. Excellent. And very impressive. And so, but Pac-Man was a game that uniquely seemed to appeal to women. And there was a lot of focus about that, a lot of excitement. Atari kept saying, we want games that appeal to women. Let's get some games for women. And then Atari, Yars Revenge went through an incredible, ridiculous, protracted testing phase. But one thing that resulted from it is one demographic that really, really liked Yars was adult women. And so magic, here it is. So I was chatting with a marketing person, and then they came out with their ad campaign. I said, hey, look, here it is. Here's a game for adult women. You wanted a game, here it is. And they came out with their ad campaign. It's all aimed at 10-year-old boys. And I'm like, what? This is a game that tests better for adults than kids and better for women. Why are you doing this? And they said, well, women don't like space action games. I said, but they like this one. He goes, no, they really don't. I said, your own testing, your own exhaustive testing says women like this game. He goes, they don't like it. It's just not the way it is. And it was just like, really? Really? Yeah. That's the kind of thing that made us have a lot of difficulty with marketing.
Yeah. And by the way, this is not, I think, unique to just that era, right, of games or media in general. And I always believe it's important, and you kind of alluded to this before, right, that the technology at the end of the day isn't really what's important. It's what we're doing with the technology that is going to be important. And so it is incumbent upon any company that's building platforms, tools, technology that enables game development to understand that at the end of the day, our responsibility is to make it easier and better for artists to make more art, to reach more people, and to allow people that want to play the ability to play reliably, right? They have an expectation for these things, they have expectation for quality and to be cared for kind of in those spaces. So the technology always comes second to the end state of that technology and where art meets that tech. And it's just, you have to constantly go back as you're building these kind of solutions out to say, why are we doing this? To make more art, more enjoyment, create more smiles, more connection. And if we do that, you build the right business, behind it. When we lose sight of that is when we get things like, well, I don't even believe my own data because what marketing tells me as a marketer that knows nothing about the games industry, that my decision or my opinion is correct. No, it's not. Right. And that's okay. You're entitled to be wrong. We all are, at some points and everything. All right. So Yars Revenge. It's launched, everything is great. And then there's this young upstart filmmaker who has this tiny independent movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Atari manages to get the license for Raiders. And they point at HSW and say, you're going to be the guy that makes the Raiders game. Okay. You get to meet with Spielberg. What the hell happened there? Like what's going through your head at that moment? As a film buff, as a movie buff,
Right. Well, you see, that's the thing is I'm a big fan of movies. I love Spielberg. I mean, I watched Duel. I used to watch his early TV stuff before he even started making movies, theater movies. He made a lot of TV stuff. I saw all that, loved it. And here's one of my idols, and I get to meet him. And so that's really cool, except the way that I'm meeting him is he's kind of interviewing me to see if I'm going to be the engineer who's going to do the game for his latest movie. So it's weird to meet an idol, but it's stranger to meet them at an interview where they're deciding if you're going to actually be able to work with them. And it was one of the most amazing days of my life. I've had a number of amazing days. A lot of them were related to Atari, but this was a cool one because I flew down. It's like, so when you're going to interview with Spielberg, he doesn't come to see you. So I started in San Jose. I get up at like 5 a.m. to go fly to LA, to go through rush hour traffic, to be at his office at 9:30. I show up there at 9:25. I just make it, in time. I show up and the first thing I hear from the receptionist is, oh, we've rescheduled your meeting till 3:30. And I'm like, what? You moved the meeting 6 hours? I flew here. It's like, well, that's what it is. But, you know, I'm a lemonade kind of guy. I like to, you know, when life gives you lemons. So what I said was, hey, this is at Warner Brothers Studios. So I said, well, can I just hang around the studios and run around till, and I'll come back at 3:30? They go, sure. So I got to spend a full day unescorted all over Warner Brothers Studios. As a film and TV buff myself, that was like heaven. It was unbelievable. I stole stuff off of sets. I took souvenirs. I did everything. It was so cool. And then at the end of that, I get to go hang out with Steven Spielberg. So I meet him. We played some Yars. I showed him Yars Revenge. He kind of dug that. He thought that was interesting. And we talked for a while. But I'll tell you the thing that I think really got me the opportunity to do the game was I explained to Steven Spielberg my theory about why he's an alien. I mean, I had a whole theory that he himself is an alien. And E.T. had not come out yet, right? I didn't know anything about E.T., just based on Close Encounters. And I just laid out this whole theory about how aliens, they're not going to show up in a spaceship and go, hi, here we are. We're going to discover they're already among us, and there'll be some sort of culturalization plan. I just figured he was the production arm of the culturalization plan. He would make movies that show aliens in positive light, and his marketing team make sure that those movies get seen all over the world in every language. So I said to him, you know, so that's what I think. I said, and by the way, you're doing a heck of a job. Nice work. And I realized, and we ended the interview. I flew back home, and the next morning I come into work and we get the word Spielberg has chosen me to do Raiders. And I just thought, I think the alien comment really had a lot to do with it. And then I proceeded to do Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I wanted to be the biggest adventure game on the system.
Well, and again, it was another one of these firsts. It was the first game on the Atari that actually required 2 controllers for a single player experience, right? Which meant you had to read the manual. And also, damn it, on that parachute level where you had to get around that stupid branch so you could get into the map room. I mean, you know, so many of us just kept doing that over and over to get in there. But one of the stories about this is you used to walk up and down the halls at Atari with a bullwhip, cracking that whip around, right? During the development
I got
of
into
this.
character. I got into character. So I went out, I got an actual 10-foot bullwhip and, you know, one of the fedora hats, a leather fedora. And I would walk, and when I was bored or when I was stuck or whatever, I would go walk around the hallways. And one of my favorite things to do, it's horrible, but I would spot like suits, marketing people, you know, so occasionally we're sort of wandering around, and I'd sneak up behind them. And that whip, I got to the point where I could crack the whip pretty well, and it was loud. It sounded like a gunshot. And I would sneak up behind marketing person, and go, whack, you know, and it's like they would like jump, and they turn around, holy crap, you know, what's going on? And it was just, you know, people knew when they heard that, oh, Howard's walking around, here we go. One of the funny things was, though, was that we would occasionally have news crews who would come in, because if they needed filler or something, you could always go to Atari and get some cute footage, you know, for filler to cover 30 or 60 seconds of your broadcast. So they happened to be there shooting some B-roll, and I happened to walk into the lab. I didn't know they were there, but I was walking around with my whip, and I walked in the lab to see some of the other programmers, and then the producer takes a look over at me walking in. They go, is that a whip? And I go, yeah. And so they go, hey, and they grab the cameraman, they come right over and they get the shot on me. They're like, and she goes, hey, so what's the whip for? And I just looked at them. I don't know where it came from. I just held up the whip. I said, the whip is for R&D, research and discipline. And I think that made the show that night. That was like, those are moments like that could happen at Atari. That's one of the things. Yeah. You see what I said? I liked a wild environment. I like kind of a crazy environment.
Oh, yes, well, you were in it.
I helped make it.
Well, you were in it. You were a conscious contributor to that, along with Todd Fry and all of the, you know, the walking the walls and all of those things, which we don't have enough time to go into all of those stories, because now I want to take you from Yars to super successful, Raiders, super successful. E.T. comes around. E.T., we got a $25 or $28 million deal that gets done. The management comes and says, we need this game done in 5 weeks. Some of management said, impossible. Big boss comes in and says to you, can it be done? You're like, of course it can be done in 5 weeks, right?
That's what I
Okay.
did.
Now
That's what I said. Absolutely.
to clear the air. Number one, it is not the worst game of all time. Number one, but by a wide margin. Because if people actually read the manual and knew how to play it, all of a sudden it becomes instantly understandable to play and a very enjoyable game to play. Number one. Number two, it, along with Pac-Man, did not cause the collapse of the video game industry here in the United States. Another kind of myth that happened. In fact, if you think about it, at the time, as we talked about, so much product coming to market, no quality control, people didn't understand what they were getting, it kind of got turned off. Coincided with the rise of the personal computer. So we didn't stop playing. We just shifted to now to Apple IIs and Commodore VIC-20s and Commodore 64s that were coming in until, right, Nintendo kind of revived under the quality control, right, seal, the console-based game series. So not a real collapse, and certainly not at the hand of E.T. and Pac-Man. All right. You're now meeting with Steven a second time to discuss this E.T. game. What did he want the game originally to be?
The beauty of that whole thing was, I got the schedule. I was given 36 hours to design the game and then get on a Learjet. This time I didn't have to take commercial flights and go to present to Spielberg, a game that had to be done in 5 weeks. I come up with the design. I do it all. I lay it out for him. It's all set. He looks at me, he goes, couldn't you do something more like Pac-Man? And I'm like, oh my God, one of the most original directors in history wants me to do a knockoff for his movie. It really bothered me for about a fraction of a second. And I realized, this is Steven Spielberg. He likes Pac-Man. It's a logical question. But the truth is, I only had 5 weeks. Yars Revenge took 7 months to make. Raiders of the Lost Ark took 10 months to make. No one had done a game in less than 5 or 6 months. And I was given 5 weeks. For the most expensive license in video game history, I was given the shortest schedule by a factor of 5. And it was like insane. It's just an insane thing to do. And so I realized, to me, it was, I came up with a credible design that I felt I could do in 5 weeks, because that's the challenge. The challenge isn't to make a great game. The challenge is to make a game you can actually finish in 5 weeks. And I had that design. And so when he says do something like Pac-Man, in my head, I knew you're not going to do a game like Pac-Man is a fine game to do. And I could even have some core pieces already set, but you have to tune it. A game like Pac-Man is tuning intensive. You really have to do a lot of tweaking, and that stuff takes a lot of time. And I don't have time. So I really couldn't do that kind of a game in that schedule. But I didn't want to say that to Spielberg. And so What I said to him was, Steven, E.T. is an amazing and special movie. And it really holds a special place. And I think it deserves a special game. It needs a game that's going to rise to the level of the movie itself and not just a knockoff of something else, and fortunately he went for it. Because if he would have said, no, but I really want Pac-Man, I would have had to say, look, I can't do that. I just can't do that in this time frame. This is what I can do. Please be okay with it. I didn't want to have to go there. And fortunately, I didn't have to.
Well, and it was a game that, and the right choice, right? A derivative game like Pac-Man, when we already had a glut of maze type of games already on the system, from horizontal ones like Jawbreaker to even Dodge 'em to Pac-Man, like all of those games in there. Hard to differentiate in market with that. Now, E.T. is played on a 6-sided cube, and that's something that people don't understand, that this isn't just a world that's wrapping, right? There is a path that you can take that holds the entire world intact, but at the time, conceptually, very difficult, right? Very difficult to understand.
It was another first in video game, right? I mean, the things that E.T. did, because it's not enough just to do a game in 5 weeks. I have to make it breakthrough in some way. I want it to be groundbreaking. I always want my games to be groundbreaking. So with E.T., it was the first game that had a 3-dimensional world that you play on. It was the first game, I think, that had context-sensitive power-up, right? Because where you were, that changed what your power was as E.T. when you exercised your power. So there were a number of concepts in there. It was also a totally non-violent game. It's kind of ironic that people think it killed the video game industry for a non-violent game, but that's a whole nother thing. But and it became known as the worst game ever. And I agree with you. I don't think it really is. But honestly, and I wanted the game to be groundbreaking in every way. And what was interesting is that the dig at Alamogordo, ultimately, E.T. did become groundbreaking in a very unusual way that I hadn't anticipated. But, people ask me a lot, what's it like to have made the worst game of all time? And the truth is, I don't believe it's the worst game. It's still, even after Return sold well over 1 million, there's fan clubs for it. It's not a horrible game, but I actually prefer it when people do identify it as the worst game of all time. I like holding that title because Yars Revenge is frequently cited as one of the best games of all time. So as long as E.T. is one of the worst, I have the greatest range of any designer in history. I've lost your audio.
I'm sorry. Yes. So you now have the bookends, right? You have the bookends from A to Z of any designer. Okay. So let's shift gears real quickly to Alamogordo, New Mexico. So for those that don't know, the idea was, sorry about the mute there. I've got 3 different mute buttons on this rig, and I don't have my cough button set up, so I have to do it manually here. So what had happened was there was so much product that made its way into market as we talked about kind of this collapse. So Atari, like most other companies, right? You can take product that's unsold, you can destroy it, and then you can use as a tax write-off. And so that way you can at least recoup some of the loss for product. And this happens obviously with physical products. And so the legend was that in the middle of the night, Atari took dump trucks full of product to Alamogordo, New Mexico, put it in a landfill, covered it with dirt, put concrete over it, and then left. And so that's the kind of thing that just then all of a sudden becomes, it's fact, and then it kind of becomes a bit of history, and then it becomes lore. So all these years later, now we're going to kind of unearth this and find if it's true. I was actually fortunate enough to meet with the production team early on to kind of, along with several other folks, to help give some background on this and where this is. And the reason I bring this up, Howard, is it's one of the failings in my career that I look back on and go, yeah, you were just stupid. So I didn't make my way out to the filming that day because I was taking care of the yard at our home that had gone neglected for a couple weeks. I'm like, I need to get this done. They're probably just going to shoot a bunch of B-roll. So all day long,
You missed it by one letter. One letter. If you would have changed that D in yard to an S, I probably would have seen you.
Right. And that's the thing. I'm getting messages from Mike Micah, who's at Other Ocean, right? And he's texting me going, why aren't you here? Look at everybody. Oh, Ernie just showed up. Oh, Howard's here. And even my wife came outside and goes, you're an idiot. Like, why did you do this? Like, you should have had your ass in the plane to be out there, right? All right. So so not only are we digging this up, but there was also an independent movie done, The Angry Video Game Nerd, the movie. I've been a huge fan of James Rolfe since he started, the nerd character. I was one of the folks that backed it. He is. And all of that kind of coincided. These two type of events happened kind of at the same time. So let's talk about the excavation first. They're digging this stuff up, and out comes not just ET, but a whole bunch of Atari product. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but at first you are like, I don't believe that actually happened or was kind of true. Like, there was some doubt in your head as to whether or not the stuff was actually buried there. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I never really believed it. Until I actually saw it, I never believed it because, like you say, yes, you can get credit and you can write off stuff that was worthless product. But by the same token, when you're already losing a tremendous amount of money, write-offs is not what you need. You need revenue. And the idea of this was the era of the Teamsters and things like that. It's a very expensive proposition to take stuff that you think is worthless, truck it out 50 to 100 miles out in the desert, bulldoze it, cement it over. That's a lot of union work to do, and you'd have to pay for it. It never made sense to me that a company that's in financial trouble would spend a tremendous amount of money to get rid of something they believe was worthless. Why don't you just throw open the doors, tell everybody, hey, come get it. They'll clean the warehouse out for you at no cost. And there you go. So it just didn't make sense to me. But what I like to say a lot of times is that when you expect things to make sense, you're losing touch with Atari, because Atari was not about making sense. Atari was about making fun and making wild stuff go. And it happened on the downslide as well as the upslide. Yeah. And it was but it was an amazing time to see that stuff come up out of the ground. It was actually an extremely emotional moment for me.
Yeah. Can you talk? And so you actually, I think, talk a bit about that in your discussion with your cameo in The Angry Video Game Nerd, the movie, which was a fictionalized story of a company wanting to capitalize on ET. They're making a game called EEE-TEE-2, and they have to go out. It's, very not safe for work type of comment and structure in the movie and everything. But at the very end, the character there, your video game nerd, one of the through lines for the years he's been doing was that he refuses to play ET because when he played as a little kid, it scarred him. So here he is at the end of the movie. They dig this thing up and he plays, and he actually does the proper review as the angry video game nerd. So
he does, and the nerd actually liked it. Yeah. And what a lot of people have said about ET was that it was kind of ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that I like to take big steps. I'm an aggressive goal setter. And that's the thing, like Raiders, I had new controller schemes. I did things that later on would become standard stuff. I did that a lot. In Yars Revenge, I did it more agreeably than I guess I did in some of the other games. But it was important to me to jump ahead and consider and find and experiment with new stuff to do. And that's what defining a new medium is all about. That was so exciting about being at Atari at that time, was that things were new and you could make up something and create something brand new and really bring it through and give people a chance to take a look at it and check it out. And some of it worked really well and some of it wasn't sufficiently tuned. I mean, with ET, I just didn't have time to tune. Video games are all about tuning, right? If you look at a real video game schedule, you will see that 50% or less of the schedule should be the basic game development, creating assets and programming the rules and getting the gameplay down. The rest of the schedule should be tuning, rumination, doing better. There's a thing I like to say about ET was the problem with ET was that I realized 100% of my design concept. That's the problem. And most people don't see that as a problem. Most people say, hey, if you got 100% of your design concept, that's pretty good. But what I would say to them is, no, I think that's horrible. Because if you realize 100% of your design concept, that means you learned nothing in the process of making the product where you could have improved and shifted the direction. Because really great products, I think, usually achieve only about 15, 20% of their original design concept because they're better. They're better than the original design concept because they improved over time. And ET didn't have the time it takes to go from the starting point and go beyond that and do better. And I even do a whole section in the book about if I would have had one more day, one more week, or 2 more months. Those are 3 different scenarios I talk about. How would I do the game differently? Because people ask me that all the time. What would you change? What would you do different?
Yeah.
Well, I would change is my investment strategy.
And what I was also going to say is, I completely agree with you that it is extremely rare, if it ever happens at all, that you're 100% right out of the gate. So you start with your assumptions and then you refine them over time. Any artist kind of goes through that process. But at the same time, you had 5 weeks. Okay. So, you had to go with a solid design. Right. There was not time to have it go through that extra layer of polish. And there has been a re-release of the game where somebody went in and kind of fixed some of those issues there. And I believe you've actually said those are some things I would have done where, if I had more time. So your legacy from Atari and the art that you created, the experience you created, not only lives on, but continues to be developed and refined and is inextricable from the fabric of video game history. So as somebody who grew up playing your games too, thank you for taking those risks, for being that crazy, for cracking whips, for jumping on planes to meet with Spielberg, for doing all of those things, because right place, right time, right storm, right, just created an artistic medium that has not been paralleled by any other form of art in the history of mankind.
Yeah, I tried to be the right person at the right time. I'll tell you something that's interesting, Chris, because one of the ways I see that there's a lot of ways to look at a video game, but one way I see it is as a piece of media. It's a media production. And as a media producer yourself, that what's the goal of a piece of media? I think it's to inform, to entertain, and to generate social discourse. To me, that's a great piece of media would do all three. Yeah. And I don't know how much people learn from each, but I'll tell you, the thing is that when I think of it as I produced a piece of media in 1982, that in 2014 was still generated, that when all those people were there and it came up out of the ground, and I could see the excitement, the groundswell, and there was international news coverage on this event. It was still a thing. And the idea that this thing that I had spent 5 weeks working on over 30 years before was still generating interest and focus and excitement and fun, that moved me. That moved me to tears, because I thought, that's it. How many pieces of media are still hot, are still doing something that many years later? So for the worst game of all time to still be, in the spotlight and the focus, it just was an amazing feeling. And that's why ET has always felt like a success to me.
Yeah, and it was, and it was. So we're going to jump. So thank you for that history, for the context, for giving us a glimpse into what it was like back at Atari and the road that you kind of walked through there. I know that after you left Atari, there was a little bit of a break there, and then you went over to 3DO and worked with folks like we talked Dave Needle and RJ Michael and Trip Hawkins, which was running it at the time, and worked on war jets and battle tanks and Jacked, I think was the name of the
Jack,
other one.
Yeah, I was the director on that project. Yeah.
So before I jump into the Q&A, we have a couple of questions from our audience here. What did you find is the most striking difference between working on extremely limited platforms like the VCS or the Atari 2600, and then having this wide open kind of media powerhouse at the time in 3DO? Which did you prefer? That's a really good question. Which did you prefer?
Okay, it's interesting. I really preferred the Atari time. I preferred having the more limited system because I prefer a work of authorship. Back then it was a work of authorship. When you get to a big, intense system, it's amazing all the stuff you can do, and it's way beyond anything you're ever going to do on the 2600, but you're not going to do that game by yourself. It's a collaborative effort. So the way I always compare it is it's the modern systems are like ocean liners. They're big modern ocean cruise liners, which are amazing places, and you can carry all kinds of supplies and you can have an amazing time. It's a huge thing, but one thing you can't do is change direction. Right. Okay. And the 2600 was like a speedboat where you can't carry that much stuff. You're just zipping around from place to place. You got to refuel on a fairly regular basis. But boy, when you get an idea and you want to suddenly go over here, we were going to go here, but wait a minute, that looks fun. Let's go over there. You can do it. You can just veer off and go. And anything I can come up with in my head, I can take a shot at realizing there. And it's a direct shot. And so it's a work of authorship versus a collaborative effort. I really enjoyed the idea of a work of authorship. Also, awesome. Although the systems are so huge, they're sort of narrowcast, right? There aren't that many different genres of game that people do because it's expensive. It's a high risk thing. People don't like to experiment as much. They want to do something that's going to make money back. Yeah. I like the high innovation environment. That's what really gets my juices flowing.
That's awesome. Awesome answer. All right. First question coming in. So in your opinion, do you think video games have reached their peak? And where can video games go from here?
Oh, man, I hope not. I hate to think that video games have reached their peak. Like with any killer app, right? We always talk about the killer app of something. New technology, whenever a new technology evolves, the first thing we do with the new technology is replicate everything that succeeded in the old technology. That's why pornography is usually one of the first profitable things on any new kind of media, right? Because people know that works, that's always sells. But new technology, it takes a while to figure out what we can really do with it. And that was the 2600. You look at the games, look at the first set of games. The 2600 was designed to do about 8 or 9 different games. That's what they conceived. It ended up doing over 1,000 different games. But the people who made it originally only created the capability. They didn't know what you could do with it. And so we're still seeing new technology comes out in gaming. Gaming is one of the places where new technology in the world is coming out. Gaming has really done much to develop VR, AR, things like that. Those are the technologies that where we're going, and we don't even know how to use those yet. We know how to pretend other stuff we've already done so far, but what's the real killer app for VR? What's the real killer app for AR? And I believe AR is going to be a bigger contribution than VR, to tell you the truth. These are horizons that we're still opening and exploring and opening up. I hope we've never hit the point where we don't have a next mountain to climb in gaming and a new revolution in experience and fun.
Yeah, I believe so long as people will continue to be creative, they're going to find new ways to express stories and connection and art that we just haven't even thought of yet, right? So in many ways, we're still kind of at the beginning, right? We're 50 years young, right? With Atari, so we still have a long road to walk.
Let me say the magic of Atari and it changed my life in the sense of recognizing is because I always thought Atari is like at the intersection of art and technology, because art is an integral part of it and technology is an integral part of it. You can't really do one without the other. They're integrated in a way, but it's like your right and left brain have to work together. Most people are one or the other. Yeah. And I've always been someone who's very balanced between the two, or imbalanced between the two is probably more accurate. But the idea of needing to use both hemispheres, I'm really attracted to things that force that. And video games do that in a uniquely wonderful way. And that's the magic of them to me.
Yep. Awesome. Agreed. All right. Out of the games you have developed in your career, do you have a favorite? If so, what makes it special for you?
Well, Yars Revenge is always going to be my favorite game, right? Because, you never forget your second, no one said ever. Okay. It's like Yars Revenge was a game that opened the world to me, established me. I got to really establish myself with that. And it became so endearing to so many people. It has just brought me so much joy and so much love over so long a time. Nothing's really going to beat Yars. But each one of my games is very meaningful to me in a lot of ways. And my next game, because there is a next game coming up, because I have actually signed a deal with Atari to do a Yars Revenge sequel. And that game is going to be a very cool game. It's going to be a very intense sight and sound extravaganza that I've got the design for it. I think it's just going to be intense. It's going to be exactly the kind of gaming experience I most enjoy.
So I imagine that we know the same people that are involved in doing this as from the development side as well. So we should have a separate conversation about that too. That's fantastic that you're doing this. Oh, okay. We're going to have a lot to discuss outside of this. All right. A couple of the questions that came in. What computer and programming language was used to write your programs for the 2600?
Well, it was a 6502 assembly language was what we wrote it in. Originally, we started with just a black box with a terminal and like just a few service routines. And that shifted over time. We started with 8-inch floppies on a very simple box. We ended up writing code and assembling it on a VAX, a Digital Equipment Corporation VAX system, and then downloading to the target box. So those were the computers that we used along the way. But the essential black boxes, the dev systems remained the same, and there was always 6502 assembly.
That's awesome. And one of the links that I got reacquainted with, there's a website that actually lets you go ahead and program 6502 assembly in the browser, and then it breaks apart all of the different components, says, okay, this is how you're going to do scrolling. This is how you're going to do color cycling. And so you get to actually go in and see the code and experiment with it and start to really understand how to do it. And it's available to anybody with a browser anywhere in the world, which is extraordinary.
Unbelievable. Sorry, it is unbelievable what is available now. And boy, if we would have had stuff then like this, I wonder if the games would have been any better. Because it's easy to do a bad game with great technology. That's for sure.
That is 100% spot on. Absolutely. Okay. Was every game back in the 2600 days written from scratch, or did you reuse, with any concept of reusing routines or components of other games to create product?
Both happened. There were people who created routines to share with others. I did that occasionally. We had techniques that we would share. But most of my games I wrote from scratch because they were targeting a very different technology. Remember that there were so many opportunities to create new technology and create new ways of approaching things to facilitate it. If you really look at Yars Revenge, you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you look at ET, you will see that the kernels, the actual code that does the screen display has different capabilities. They're not really interchangeable. So they had to be different to accommodate what I needed to do with the game. But there were people who would take kernels or would take large segments of code from one game and port that over to another game to save time. Both happened.
Yeah, and with you explaining it that way, I realized that the three principal games that you did at Atari were all unique or provided something that had not been done before in a game. So there wasn't anything to reuse. You were literally creating the template that others would follow for those types of games, whether it's a six-sided fully realized world, dual control games that also required you to flip switches on the console itself, which, as a kid, you're like, wait, which is the one that I need to do again? And here comes a snake down the screen. I have to figure out how to get out of the way. Again, back to Yars, and everything from the force field just being garbage that you were dumping to the screen because you didn't have enough memory to actually create that. So you were just, when you see, for those that don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you see that force field in Yars, you are seeing the visual representation of the actual code running at that time.
Exactly.
Right?
What I did was to save space and time, I would just grab a byte of code because I didn't have room for graphics, and I would throw it in the graphics register, and then I would throw it in the color register, and it pseudo randomized the whole thing for me. So it actually was a very elegant way of doing something that had high visual impact and made no sense in terms of actual creative production. And that was what I was all about. Was finding new ways or abusive ways of producing something that was fun in the mind of the user, the player.
Incredible. Just incredible. Okay, another question we have here. Are you still playing games while you're going to be developing, following to one of the greatest games of all time? If so, what systems or games are you playing, and what do you like about them?
Mostly I'm playing handheld stuff. I mean, I play on my phone. I play an occasional golf game. I have to cop to the fact that I'm kind of a Soda Crush junkie.
Yeah.
Candy Crush, Soda Crush, a lot of those things, I get sucked into those pretty desperately. So I do still enjoy a fun game. And I'll look at fresh games and new games. I like to look at that because you can see fresh gameplays. You can see some new things going on here. I always like to see what someone's doing that hasn't been done before.
And look, I mean, the Candy Crush games are built on the back of a very solid gameplay framework and mechanic, right? Which, nobody says, well, my favorite game is Tetris, and people look at them with derision. I don't understand that. In my opinion, when we talk about, the kind of the way game culture has grown up is, oh, well, those aren't real gamers. I'm like, look, if somebody's playing a Candy Crush or a derivative type of game for 15 hours a week, they're no different than somebody playing Call of Duty for 15 hours a week. Like, we're all nerds for something. And that's what's great is we have the greatest variety of game types, target markets, and devices than we've ever had in the industry. And it's only going to continue, right, to grow from there. So that's awesome.
It's exciting.
It's incredibly exciting. Incredibly exciting. So I think the last question we had, which I think we kind of discussed, if someone repeats the claim that ET killed the industry and points the blame at you, how do you respond to that?
Well, that's cool. The way, when people say ET killed the industry, I thank them, for the credit, but I really can't own it. And I wrote a whole book explaining what the real causes of the crash are. Using a combination of my backgrounds as an engineer, as a game programmer, as a technologist, as an economist, and as a psychotherapist. I think I cover most of the bases in terms of what really happened with it. When people tell me it's the worst game of all time and that it's a horrible game, I have one question I always ask them. I simply say, oh, have you ever played it? And it's amazing how frequently the answer is no.
Yep.
And it just, that sort of fixes the conversation. Somebody's telling me something so horrible. Oh, have you tried it? No. Oh, well, I guess that sort of frames the opinion right there.
Yeah, perhaps you should take a moment out of your day, right, to do this. I also use the same type of you know, I use the same type of thing when talking to my kids, and when they were younger and their friends. Oh, well, games back then, were so simple and this and that. And then I throw them in front of my Robotron cabinet and I go, "That's great. Like, go ahead and try it. This stick moves, this stick shoots." And literally it's hands on sticks for 5 or 10 seconds and they die. And then they're like, "Wait a minute." I'm like, "No, there's no auto aim. There's no pathfinding assist. There's no, like, it is your reflexes and as fast as you can move through it." Like, that's what games were back then, right? It was.
Robotron is one of my all-time favorites. I mean, it is one of my all-time favorites. I just think that is a fabulous game. Eugene Jarvis, who also did Defender and Robotron, there's a guy who's probably one of the greatest game designers ever.
Absolutely. And look, the fact that the largest arcade manufacturer in the world is Eugene Jarvis's company, Raw Thrill Games. Like, he's still out there doing it. I know that I think he was at Atari for a little while in the pinball division of that. I believe that he was over there doing that era. So, excellent. Well, I don't think I have any more questions from our group. If anybody has a final question they would like to ask Howard before we wrap up, please go ahead and put it into the chat. Also, the reminder, the link to Howard's book, Once Upon Atari, is right there, little image there, and there is the tiny URL to go ahead and direct you back over to Amazon's page.
Hey, or just go to onceuponatari.com.
Or onceuponatari.com is the preferred way to do it to get a signed copy from Howard. And so, without an additional question, I have one last one for you, which is, can you tell us briefly, what was, and you kind of alluded to this, but actually, I apologize. We've already discussed this. So the question was, what did you remember most fondly about your time at Atari? And then when did you kind of know that the writing was on the wall and you kind of needed to move on from there? I didn't put it in the body of our other questions because this one is more of kind of a personal, kind of like introspective sort of question. So, like, if you sat back and you said, "Man, this is the thing that pops out in my head all the time, is my favorite," and then kind of when I knew this was the end.
There were a few moments here and there as things were winding down in 1983. Where I kind of felt it was slipping away a little bit. It didn't become real. I didn't really think, until they actually sold it to Atari and I met Jack Tramiel. I had an interview with Jack Tramiel and he was saying who's going to stay and who's not going to stay in terms of working with them. And at that point, that was an incredibly, incredibly sad moment. I go into this pretty deeply in the book about one of the first major depressions of my life was when I realized I had to leave Atari and ending at Atari. And I realized that the Atari that I knew was dead. It was gone. And it was such an amazing place. It was this amazing awakening in my life. And then to have the door just slam shut on it, which is what it kind of felt like. And then to have to walk away, it was devastating. It was devastating to feel that my dream come true, my amazing dream job was just done so fast and was all happened in a flash and then it was gone. And I was just left to contemplate the aftermath. And I didn't know it at the time, but it would be about 25 years until I found a pursuit that was as satisfying, at least as satisfying as my time at Atari. And that was becoming a psychotherapist.
Yes.
That's something that's even better than Atari was, but I spent over 2.5 decades searching. And I did a lot of things, I meandered. I mean, I've been through 4 or 5 different careers. I always like to try something new. I like the innovation thing. It was devastating. Leaving Atari at the end was devastating.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of us that kind of grew up in the earlier part of the tech industry too, where you're kind of, cutting your teeth and growing up there, to have those companies fold or move on, not become what they were. I mean, it is like leaving your home. It's like leaving part of your family behind.
Very much so.
Yeah. Also, do you know who played Darth Vader's theme when the Tramiels first came in, or is that kind of held to secrecy? My understanding is that when the Tramiels first came in, somebody had started to play that over the PA system.
I will never reveal.
Awesome, as expected. So, Howard, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend this time with us. It was absolutely fascinating. It was a personal thrill for me. Let's try to not make the next time we talk be, 10, 15 years. And again, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, please go ahead and check out Once Upon Atari. You can go check that out on his website or the link there. And again, Howard, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
All right.
Good times.
Likewise. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Kay.